Hi there, and welcome back. This is the second video in a 6-part series on Modeling for Clarity, a workshop from the Understanding Group. I'm Joe Elmendorf. In video 1, we talked about what a model is and why we model. You all had a chance to play around with making models without receiving any real instruction on how to make a model. In this video, I'll share with you some of the methods and processes that I've been using to make models every day as an information architecture consultant. For the bulk of this video, I'll be introducing you to a framework that I developed, both for novice modelers as a means to guide their understanding of what's important when creating clear models, as well as for expert modelers, like my colleagues at the Understanding Group, as a guide for getting and giving helpful feedback to one another. After registering for this workshop, you should have received a set of cards. Start by placing these cards out in front of you. I'm going to begin by introducing the anatomy of these cards. So each card follows a similar convention. The color of the card represents the series that it belongs to. There are 3 series in total. We'll cover all the series in the upcoming videos. So the large white block text across the top is the name of the card. On the side with the solid color, the title is followed by a summary description of that card, and at the bottom, the card series is listed in white. As I introduce each series, I'll tell you about what they're each for, but there's also a reference card that includes a brief description of each of the card series. Okay, so if we flip over the card now, you'll find application questions. These are prompts that you can ask yourself to help get into the right mindset when considering the concepts on these cards. Next, you'll find usage guidelines. These are refinements on how to apply these cards to your work, further clarifications that either loosen or constrain their use. And then lastly, the majority of the cards will feature an example that shows what the card means. So let's get into the first series, the Model Program series. Per the description of this series on the series guide card, a model program isn't about coding software. When we talk about a program for our models, we're using the word program more like an architect would. A program is like a plan. A program defines what something is and is not going to be. Use these cards to help establish what will be modeled and why before getting into how it will be modeled. This will lead to clearer, more effective models. Now, some of you might be wondering what a good model looks like. I hinted at it before and I want to be clear about it now. This is not the right kind of question. We are not going to be talking about making models that look good in this workshop. Instead, I want you to be focused on how to make good models. And when I say a good model, I'm talking about a useful model. We make models to help us do something. We don't just make models for the heck of it. If you try to make a model without knowing why you want to make a model, you're not going to make a very useful model. Useful models always stem from an intent. The why drives the making of a model. Because we aren't just making pictures for the sake of pictures. We're telling stories. We're crafting arguments. As George Lakoff would say, not as war, but as a dance where the goal isn't decimation of the opposition, but rather balance and play. The reason we start with the Model Program series of cards is because it's important to start by figuring out what you want to model and why before you start. Similar to the infinite monkey theorem, where if you give an infinite number of monkeys an infinite number of typewriters, they'd be able to recreate the entire works of Shakespeare. I'd argue that the only way to create a clear, well-suited model without being clear about what you want to accomplish is to give an infinite number of monkeys an infinite number of Sharpies and paper. To help us keep track of the decisions we're making about the model program, we have the Model Program Placard. I keep a PDF of this on my computer to use for digital models, and I have a small stack of them that I keep printed on my desk for when I want to sketch something out. Whenever I start a new model, I'll spend a little time at the beginning filling it out, and then I'll have a physical reference for what my model is supposed to do. When I'm working on a model for myself, I keep the Model Program Placard in close proximity to my model, often in the lower right corner of the model, like a title block of a technical drawing. I find that having the intent in my face all the time is helpful for remembering what I'm supposed to be doing. Because if you don't have an intent set ahead of time, if you haven't established what you want your model to be about, then all you can do is hope and pray that whatever you make happens to be the thing that you need. Without a model program, it's really hard to figure out if your model is moving you forward, and you risk wasting a lot of time making things that may or may not be helpful. The first card in this series gets right at the heart of preempting issues. It's the intent card. If you don't know what you want to show, learn, or explore, you can't create a very meaningful model. I don't like making sweeping statements and generalizations, but I think that this one holds. The only way to reliably create a meaningful model is to first know what you want to show, learn, or explore. When we flip over the intent card, we can explore the application questions for this card. Why are you making a model? What are you trying to learn? What questions do you have? What do you know that you suspect others might not know? And what might happen or will continue to happen if you didn't make this model? These questions help us get in the right frame of mind to establish our intent for the model. When determining intent, remember, models are for making the complex clear, first for yourself and then for others. Anytime we're exposed to something new, a new job, a new project, a new client, or even a new life situation, we're trying to understand that new thing in relation to something that we already understand. According to Richard Saul Wurman, it's the only way that we can learn. Imagine you found yourself faced with a new software application, and you're expected to start using it. You might be thinking, if only I could understand what this software does, then I could figure out how to use it. Instead of staring blankly at the user manual or looking into the depths of the system's interface, hoping you learn by osmosis, you could make a model to work through your understanding and use that first thought as your model's intent. I need to understand what this software does. There's a difference between your intent for a model and what the purpose of your model is, the larger goal that has you modeling in the first place. If you need to understand a new software application, there's a desired end, to be able to use that software application. Additionally, there was a hunch, a hypothesis, for why you didn't know how to use it. You don't understand what the software is supposed to do. A model intent is almost always based on a hypothesis about what needs to be understood to move closer to achieving the larger goal. But rarely will a model itself achieve your larger goal. It's a step in the desired direction, a way to create firm ground on which you can reach new heights. At Tug, we're often hired to help bring together multiple vast worlds of information, complete systems that operate entirely on their own. That's the goal, to bring together two worlds into one coherent, cohesive place. But no model is going to do that on its own. I rely on my experience, and if I don't have enough of that, my ignorance, about what exists to create my modeling intent. What are the parts of the software? Or what are the similarities and differences between the systems? These are examples of model intents that would help me get closer to my end goal of uniting these two disparate worlds. Models help us understand something so that we can achieve something else. Back to our example. Our model intent is simple. I need to understand what the software does. The intent doesn't need to be complicated. It doesn't need to be fancy. What's most important is it just needs to be acknowledged and stated. Often, early on in my modeling process, I'll start with a general statement of intent. And maybe halfway through, I'll have a realization, a refinement of clarity and purpose, and I'll make a refined statement of intent. Often that refined statement of intent is more narrow than the original, allowing me to discard or at least set aside large portions of what I was considering before. Not because it was bad, but because it just wasn't what I need right now. Perhaps the intent has changed from I need to understand what the software does to what really needs to happen, which is identify the parts of the software. I can refine the statement of intent anytime throughout the process. But the important thing is that I'm always working within and towards my stated intent. The statement of intent serves as a constraining focus, a guiding star that helps you move in the right direction and not get distracted by the multitude of other directions you could go in. In the first activity, you got to experience the struggle of trying to create a meaningful model without a clear sense of why you were modeling. And even while this video is pre-recorded, I can all but guarantee that there were very diverse approaches to a single, seemingly straightforward prompt. That's what happens when there's a lack of stated intent. Things can go in any number of directions. Okay, so now we've gone through what the intent card is. Let's build out an intent together. Let's imagine that we're responsible for redesigning a university's website. That's our end goal. One of the steps towards getting there is understanding and reflecting back what the stakeholders want from this newly redesigned website. In short, why aren't they just keeping it the way that it is? We might say to ourselves, I need to understand the stakeholder needs for this university website. This is a great use for a model because stakeholder needs are normally invisible, and in order to discuss and align around them, we need to make them understandable and visible to all. This intent, understand the stakeholder needs for a university website, it's not complicated, and it becomes our guiding star. If at any point we're including something that's tangential to delivering on this intent, we know that we should refocus. Once we've got an intent to start with, we write it down on our placard so that we don't lose track of it. We start with the intent card because it sets up the rationale for the rest of the decisions we'll be making, both in the model program card series as well as the consideration card series that'll come next. Once we have an understanding of our intent, we can move on to the second card in the series, audience. I find this to be a natural next card because so often the audience is implied, if not stated, in my statement of intent. But it really is important to be clear about who your intended audience is. We can make models for anyone, for ourselves, for a specific group, for mass consumption. Who we're making a model for affects how we make the model most effective. User-centered design folks know that making something without knowing who you're making it for is a recipe for failure. The same thing goes here. I find being clear about my audience also helps me clarify my intent statement, and it guides some of my decisions as I work through the other cards in the consideration series. Knowing who you're making a model for will allow you to tune how careful you need to be with your model. When you're making a model just for you, there's a lot that you don't need to make explicit in order for it to be useful. Only the parts that you're trying to work through and learn yourself. Models that we make for other people require more care to include the right context and avoid assuming everyone knows what you're modeling. When we're modeling for others, they can be others who have almost exactly the same context and background for this model as we do, or they can be complete strangers to the concepts and subject that we're modeling. Having a sense of how near or far your intended audience is to your understanding of what you're modeling will help you make the right decisions on what to include and how careful you need to be in order to make a clear and useful model. Right now, as we're learning about modeling, we're going to focus on making models that are just for us. So let's document that on our program placard. This is a model just for us. Models for us are a lot easier to make, and they're how every other model usually starts. If you can't or haven't made something clear for yourself, how can you make it clear for somebody else? After we've stated our audience, we can figure out which of the aspects are relevant. Models are an extremely vast and versatile tool. We can model anything in the world, any system, any object, any idea, and all of those things that can be modeled have many aspects to them. An aspect of something is a particular subset or dimension of that thing. When we consider an aspect of a thing, we are considering part of it, not the thing in its entirety. In order to create a model that's clear, we can only include a few aspects of the thing that we're modeling. Think of aspects like dimensions or axes on a chart. A single axis, the x-axis, gives you something to work with, but it doesn't provide that much information. Adding a second axis, the y-axis, increases information that can be understood about a thing. And then we could add a third dimension, the z-axis, and the amount of information exponentially increases. But introducing a fourth, fifth, or sixth dimension, let alone an 11th dimension, takes things from more clear to incomprehensible. Even while those dimensions might show true or accurate information, a model can only show so much at one time while still remaining clear. This is a limitation of modeling as a tool compared to the high fidelity multidimensionality of actually building something, but a limited number of aspects is also a strength, as it requires us to focus on understanding the most meaningful things relative to our intent. I like to think about aspects of a thing in two different categories. First, we have the facets of the thing. These are the dimensions and attributes of the thing being modeled. Is it round and solid? Does it have stages of growth? These are the aspects of what makes the thing up, regardless of whether or not it's a physical object. If you were the owner and had created this thing, these are the facets. These are the things that you could change, these aspects. The second type of aspect are the external forces that are acting upon the thing. Unless your thing lives in a physical and conceptual vacuum, there are always external forces acting upon it. These can be physical forces happening in a natural system like weather and age, or conceptual forces derived from what people expect of a thing or feel about a thing. Regardless of how you feel about these outside forces, even as the owner and creator of a thing, you don't get to change these aspects. Instead, it's your job to understand these forces and design something that accommodates them. Let's use an example to look closer at forces and facets. While I model many different things in my life, my professional work is mainly focused on architecting digital systems. And as such, I pulled together a set of aspects that I've adapted from the levels that Abby Covert offers us in her book, How to Make Sense of Any Mess. And they work really well for dealing with how to divide up different aspects of a digital system. Let's start with the external forces. Remember, these are the aspects we can't change, but need to understand and adapt to. In a digital system, these are often the business intent, the users, and the ecosystem. The business intent is what the business stakeholders, the people who are paying you to make something or who have a say in whether or not it's successful, it's what those people want out of a thing. The users are the people who will or do use the thing you are creating, the thing that is the end goal. These are different than the people who will be using your model. We talked about them before in the audience card. The ecosystem is the larger context or environment that your thing is situated in. I read an article about the creation of a Lego set based on the International Space Station. It talked about how an astronaut had brought Lego up with him and created a scale model of the space station while on the space station. Lego, however, couldn't use that model because it wasn't actually capable of remaining together on Earth. The model could only stay together in the low gravity environment where it had initially been created. Lego had to redesign the model such that it could survive in the environment where most Lego users are on Earth. Next, we have facets, the dimensions and attributes of the thing itself that are common in digital systems. These facets can describe different conceptual levels of granularity. The most broad and high level is the system or concept of what you're modeling. This aspect considers the whole of your thing. It talks about the overall idea and framing for why the thing exists. It's not about how it's made or how it functions. It's focused on what it is. The next level is the structure. This gets at the parts of your thing and how those parts are arranged and put together to create a whole, without yet getting into the detail of any of the parts. The next level lower is interface, the parts that the user interacts with. This is where we start to get into screens and flows, all the things that people interact with. And lastly, the element. These are the most fine-grained levels of your thing, whatever the smallest unit there is. Maybe we're talking about buttons or sliders or modals. Maybe we're talking even finer grain about HTML tags and JavaScript methods. This level is very much focused on how something works. Now, I mentioned that these 7 aspects work well to describe the different dimensions of a digital system. But if you were to go about modeling a non-digital system, you'd want to adapt some of them, but the overall paradigm remains. If the thing I'm modeling is actually a person, there are still environmental forces, and there are still facets of the person themselves. While business stakeholders might not feel quite right, perhaps cultural expectations or family is a similar force in a person's environment that serves as a similar external governing force. User as an external force might not make much sense in this case, as it gets a little confusing and dehumanizing to think about someone using a person, but a person could have competing internal goals or desires that act as forces in their lives. Ecosystem certainly is still relevant. A person living in a city would have vastly different forces on them than somebody living in an otherwise uninhabited desert. When we think about the facets of a person, we could talk about the person as a whole, similar to the system concept level. We could talk about their structure, physical structures like their skeleton and organ arrangement, emotional, psychological, and cognitive structures. Interface might not be appropriate as a term, but we could talk about that person's senses that frame what they perceive. And lastly, element. There is a physiological, cellular level of granularity that we can talk about and still be talking about a person. There are so many aspects to any one thing, and we can model any of them. But in order to create clear models that are directed and understandable, we need to be selective about which ones we're going to focus on. There isn't a hard rule about how many aspects can be included in a single model, but rather a general maxim that the more aspects you include, the more confusion and misinterpretation you invite. By naming the aspects, either using the ones I've introduced or adapting your own tailored set, you're able to split up the world you are trying to model and better focus your model on the particular aspect that you need to deliver on. We can look back to our example intent, understand the stakeholder needs for a university website, and think about which of the 7 aspects seem most relevant to this intent. If we go through the list of aspects, we can figure out which one fits best. Business intent. That one fits. In order to deliver on our intent, we need to understand what the business wants for their new website. We can check that box on our placard. Users. That doesn't really fit at this point, so we can skip it. We aren't focused on end users, we're focused on the business. Ecosystem. The larger context will come into play later, but the ecosystem is outside of what the stakeholder needs are, so we can skip that one too. System, structure, interface, element. All of these have to do with the website as a digital place, but we aren't there yet. We're still just trying to figure out what the stakeholders need out of this place. So we aren't going to focus on any of those in this model either. So we have one aspect that's relevant to our model's intent, the business intent force, and it's checked on our model program placard. A reason I like selecting aspects ahead of time is not only because it gives me a direction to move towards, it also allows me to ignore the other 6 aspects that aren't going to help with this model. And then when people bring up issues in discussion, I find great freedom in being able to confidently say to myself and others, that is not what this model is trying to make clear. So while you might have uncovered some truth, it belongs in a different model, while having a solid rationale to back me up. Don't think about limiting your model's aspects as a restriction to making something clear. It's actually the opposite. Limiting your model's aspects greatly enhances your model's ability to be clear. That doesn't mean that another model won't address the other aspects. Other models need to address those aspects. But this model is only going to be focused on making the business intent aspect understandable. So you have your intent stated, serving as your guiding star, and you've selected 1 or 2 aspects that you find particularly relevant to delivering on that intent. Next, we need to get into our level of abstraction. A model of a thing is not the thing. All models represent their subject somewhere along the spectrum from high abstraction to low abstraction. So in talking about levels of abstraction, we can consider something as simple as a stapler. If we were to photograph this stapler, we'd have a low abstraction model, a low abstraction representation of what a stapler looks like. That photograph is a model, and as such it can convey a lot of information about what the stapler looks like, but it wouldn't tell us much about how it functions. Someone trying to create a better stapler wouldn't find a photograph of a stapler as helpful as someone maybe browsing staplers to purchase. The level of abstraction of a model allows for different kinds of conversations to take place. A photograph of a stapler is very low abstraction. It allows conversations about aesthetics and finishes. An exploded drawing of a stapler is maybe mid-abstraction. It still might appear to be a stapler, but it's obvious that it's not actually a stapler. That exploded drawing might help someone understand how a stapler is put together and optimize its construction, something that a lower abstraction model might not do as well. We could create an even further abstracted model of the same stapler that explores the use of a stapler or an analysis of materials. Such a model wouldn't immediately reveal that we're even talking about a stapler. But if we were trying to reimagine staplers, this might be the more helpful model. Models can take any number of forms or shapes, and it's important to set the form based on what your intent is. The form is dictated by who the audience is, which aspects we're including, and what level of abstraction is most appropriate for facilitating the kinds of conversations we want to have about a model, the kinds of play that we want the model to provoke. Back to our example of stakeholder needs for a university website focusing on business intent. We start by reminding ourselves of our intent. Everything about this model needs to be in service of the intent. We ask ourselves, given our intent, what kinds of conversations might happen if I present the business intent in a low abstraction model? What might that even look like? What about a high abstraction model? Would I have a different conversation? How might the high abstraction model show things differently than a low abstraction model? Is there a halfway point, a mid-abstraction model? What kinds of conversations can that level of abstraction help facilitate? For this example, I want to have this be a mid-level of abstraction. I want to be able to talk about some details, but I also want to look at overarching trends. So I'm going to pick a middle-of-the-road level of abstraction to document on my model program placard. Now, if you can't figure out the most appropriate level of abstraction, you can start answering these questions by just starting to make examples to populate your model based on what you know, and then ask yourself if the levels of abstraction of the examples are helping you explore your intent or taking you off target. A lot of how I decide on a level of abstraction comes just from trial and error. I've seen what happens when I try to talk about highly abstracted concepts using low abstraction models. I've seen how I get distracted and how those conversations get derailed and driven by what can be seen rather than what I stated as the intent of this playful model. A helpful exercise for thinking through the level of abstraction is a Black Mirror-like exercise. Thinking about all the ways that you or someone else might be derailed or distracted from having the discussion that you intend. Once you've identified the distractions, is there a way that you can just remove them? Does that mean increasing the level of abstraction? There's a tension, though, between increasing abstraction to focus attention on a concept and decreasing abstraction to increase comprehension by showing something literal. I like how Austin Gavella puts it in his book, Collaborative Product Design. He uses the term fidelity almost as the inverse of abstraction, saying the further someone is from something, the less they can tolerate low fidelity, high abstraction. When someone is close to something, on the other hand, they can tolerate a lot of abstraction or have something be low fidelity while still understanding it. Lastly, this spectrum of abstraction is not absolute. There's no scale from 0 to 100 where 65 means the same thing across all models. It's far from that. Like what we're applying it to, the spectrum of abstraction is a model for us to explore and play with. It's a model that invites us to ask, is there a more abstract way to represent this? Is there a less abstract way? What are the risks? What are the benefits? It serves as a way for us to document our general and relative approach for how we're going to represent the aspects we've chosen to best deliver on our intent. We've gone over all 4 parts of the model program, filling out our placard as we went. We started with the modeler's intent for their yet-to-be-made model and talked about how this intent guides the rest of our decisions as we make our models. We talked about how the audience you're making a model for, whether it's just you or some other people, affects the methods and tactics you'll use to make it clear. We explored the different aspects of what could be modeled, how deciding what would be included and what would not be included in our model can help us not get overwhelmed and keep our model understandable. We learned about the spectrum of abstraction and how the level of abstraction allows for different kinds of conversations to happen, and how to have a model that guides participants towards those conversations rather than derailing them. The model program, as documented with a model program placard, has 2 primary functions. Before and during the modeling process, the intent, audience, aspects, and abstraction level serve to guide the modeler to create representations efficiently. And then after the model has been created, the program placard serves to set up the model to be understood by others and help peers align on the desired outcome of the model so that constructive and applicable feedback can be provided. By positioning the model program placard in close proximity to our models, the model program can be a constant source of context for what this model is about and how it should be used. Let's look at some examples of completed model programs alongside the models that were created for those model programs. The first model is a quick model that I made to express my understanding of an e-commerce progression and the information that was revealed at different stages of the e-commerce funnel, from top-level categories all the way down to the product detail page. We can look at the program for this model and see that the intent is show how the kinds of information changes as the user goes deeper into a category. This model was just for me. I quickly sketched it out as a way to explore and get a sense of whether or not this hunch that I had about these relationships worked out. I was focused on the structure of the pages, the hierarchy of the category page types, as well as some interface level, showing where on the pages, in broad terms, different kinds of information could appear. And lastly, this is a mid to low abstraction. It's not terribly hard to see that this is a website. I could imagine this being more abstract, but I don't think that would help me because we were at a point where we needed to be making propositions for how the interface would change. I could imagine it being lower abstraction as well, but again, working with screens, I wanted to be mindful both of how long I spent on this model, lower abstraction would have taken longer, as well as invited discussion of design and interaction, things I wasn't yet interested in discussing. This next model is a content model for a large nonprofit organization. This is the final version, but there were many sketchier versions that helped me get to this point. The intent for this model was to provide a frame for locating all of the site content based on the type and use of that content. The idea here was to make a way for people to look at a piece of content and pick a section on this triad where the content fits. Additionally, parts of the structure of the website were primed to handle particular sections of this triad. When those 2 activities were completed, there would be a paint by numbers kind of mapping of content items to website structure. So this model was for others, and they had some context, but not a lot. The effort would be distributed. There were some people who would have a lot of context, but there were plenty of others who would be mapping content to this model, who wouldn't know where it came from, or exactly how it would be used outside of just what this model expressed. This model focuses on the structure of the content, as well as a specific attribute of the user, their level of engagement with the content. Lastly, this is a pretty highly abstract model. It takes some complex thinking to understand and get to how this becomes a tool for a website. The third model program we'll go over is for this model. This is a content model for a large, committee-based professional organization. Per the intent, we needed to show the interactions between content types and the key factors between them. This model was so high level, it showed both the system as a whole and key structures within it, as well as which key demographics of users would find parts relevant or not. This is a very abstract model. I can't imagine including this many aspects and this many details in a more abstract way. I would also argue that the only reason we were able to successfully include 3 aspects in this model is because it is so abstracted. If the model was less abstract, we'd likely need to remove 1 or 2 of the 3 included aspects. Now, out of respect for the client, we have abstracted the model even further. It's now to the point where the only thing we can talk about is the model itself and not any of the subject of the model. The actual model doesn't look like what we're looking at right now. The actual model looks like this. But we're going to talk about this more abstracted version for the sake of discussion. This organization had many products and service verticals, represented by the columns in this model. The colored bands going across it are different parts of each vertical that we wanted to highlight. At the center is the green band. This is where we listed all the things each vertical had to offer. Maybe it was a document or a product or an event. The green band is situated within the blue band, which shows the different arrangements or taxonomies that could apply to and across the verticals. These could be things like themes and topics, time, or industry sector. Extending out from the blue box, both up and down, are the pink and orange bands. These represent 2 main ways that people interact with the offerings of each vertical, either in a consumption-like behavior, as represented by the pink, or in a contribution or participation-like behavior, as represented by the orange. The sponsorship band in yellow can be thought of as an extension of the orange contribution band, where sponsorship is almost thought of as a more intense version of contribution. All the way on the right, there's a column called My Account, where the different bands connect to provide snapshots into the activity and participation of a particular user. Lastly, along the bottom is a roles matrix that shows which kinds of key roles would want to use each of the vertical offerings. The last model program that we'll look at is for a simple user model. We wanted to highlight and explain a core distinction between 2 primary user types. This model was intended for others, but they had a fair amount of context for what this model was about, but they also had a rather limited amount of resources to devote to their website. So we didn't want to go overboard with this model. I called this a user model a moment ago because that's the only aspect we're focusing on. And the level of abstraction is moderately high. Again, because we didn't want to overdo it with the details in this model. We thought, what is the most important thing that we can convey to the client about their customers? And that one thing was that everyone who comes to them sits on this spectrum of either wanting to know how to use their products or wanting to know why to use their products. That concludes this video on the Model Program series of the Clear Models Framework. In the next video, we'll get into how to make a model now that we've created a model program. See you next time.